All right, we'll let anybody who's coming in late. And we'll get started on time because lunch is next, so I promise not to make anybody late for lunch. These are important things. So you're in the Everyday Agile for One talk. My name is Elsa Vezino, and I've been coding for a couple years now. And I want to talk to you about having an agile mindset and how it can help you and in whatever you are working on. Now, this is also a conference, so if you find at any point that you're like, yeah, this doesn't really apply, or this isn't working for me, it's totally okay to leave and go to another session. You're here to learn, and the things you're learning should be relevant for you. So if you find that they're not, nothing personal, go find something that is relevant for you to make the most of your time as well. We'll take some questions. I'll leave a lot of time at the end for questions if you have some. I'm all on board with taking some questions throughout the presentation, especially for like clarification, or if I'm talking about something that you're not quite familiar with, like some sort of a process or an agile term that you're not familiar with, let me know. I'll explain it because we're all coming in from different backgrounds and we have a different understanding of what agile is and what we've experienced as well. So some of the terms aren't familiar to you, that's okay. Go ahead and ask. Also, a lot of the things I'll be talking about today are not strictly a software development process. A lot of them apply as in your software development skills and what you're doing, but all of this will be from a development perspective. All right, now we'll get started. So most of us hear about Agile in the context of a team, which is great, and this is not unmerited since a lot of the processes that we put around how we do development and working with a team is to take care of the communication and all the design decisions that we're doing collectively together. So there's a lot of emphasis on the process and the communication between the team. But if you're anything like me, and you found yourself in a lot of situations where you really don't have anybody else to bounce your ideas off, or you don't have someone to look at your code, or when it comes down to the end of the day, you're really the one who makes the decisions when you really kind of wish there was someone else there to make the decision. So some situations where this could be is you're working on a hobby project. You are your own business owner. You are your own stakeholder. It could be that you're in a small project where it doesn't merit more than one developer and nobody else is really engaged. Or you could be, unfortunately, just kind of left to your own devices in some sort of a work setting as well. So there's a lot of situations where you might find that, hey, I don't have a real tight team that I can do a lot of these agile practices that I hear about. So today we're going to downscale some of the practices you may have heard about and see how they can apply to a team of one. So one of my favorite blogs, which is Coding Horror, you may have heard of, in 2007, Jeff Atwood in there had a post about the dangers of programming alone. So as a result, he challenges his readers to demand working with their peers, not only for survival in your career, but also as a matter of growth. And this is something I strongly support, working with others. But there's a lot of situations where it doesn't merit working with more than one developer at a time. So whether it's by choice that you work by yourself or by your circumstance, here's some tips and tricks and some ideas. We'll call them recipes for this case. That you can use to apply to your own work every day. So I want to clarify what I mean by solo, first of all. Solo doesn't mean alone, because even this guy, Han Solo, wasn't alone. He had friends as well. So rarely we're truly alone in what we're doing. We're not usually working in a vacuum, especially with the growing dependency we have the internet. I mean, try to go a day without looking at something up on Stack Overflow. I guess you could go a day, but it's going to be hard to go for a week without looking something up. So not usually totally by ourselves. All right, so another segue, food. I really, really enjoy food, and this is going to be a theme throughout this presentation. Give you something a little bit more meaty, so to speak, to hang on to for some of the examples. So this is my breakfast one morning at home, because lucky for me, my husband is a fabulous cook. Not by profession, but by hobby. And so one of the things I've come to be amazed by is what comes out of our very modest kitchen that looks like something you might find on Food Network. But we don't have a professional chef. We don't have entire food network behind us to make these things. All it really takes is it takes one person and some process and preparation. So just like that, you can also make really good outcomes with your software development with a little bit of addition of process and preparation around what you do. So my foray into Agile was a little confusing. I did know that it was supposed to be something really cool. I didn't quite know what it meant, and I kept hearing about it because it was this wonderful buzzword. So a couple things that I did hear about up front was that real Agile projects are iterative. Scrum and Agile are the same thing, or at least there's a lot of confusion around it when I'd ask people what's the difference. I didn't get a lot of straight answers. I might also hear, especially from our higher-ups, that, you know, we need to be more agile, we'll get better results, everything will be better. So all these statements are kind of condensed down, and they're either oversimplifications or they're just outright wrong. So when I'm talking about Agile, I'm talking about the Agile Manifesto, which is a document that came out in 2001. There's a group of 17 professionals at the time who got together and decided they wanted to have a better way to approach software development. So you can find the entire Agile Manifesto online at agilemanifesto.org. It only takes about 3 minutes to read the entire thing. They came up with 4 values and 12 principles. So the 4 values that are shown here, we value all these things, even the things in the small part, the small text. So process tools, comprehensive documentation, contract negotiation, following a plan. These are all very important things. But the manifesto states that we value the things in the big print over the things in the small print. So in this case, we value the ability to respond to change more than we value following a plan. So if we're working on something and we need a new requirement comes in, something changes, we value being able to respond to that over sticking to, oh no, this is what we started with, this is what we're going to follow through with. So we value all these things, but the things in the big print are the things that are more important when push comes to shove. So the result of this document was that it was very people-oriented and very flexible, which works for a lot of software situations where we're, well, working with a lot of people, but also dealing with a lot of changing requirements. So this, again, is not a silver bullet, but the Agile Manifesto and the Agile approach to a lot of the systems we work on works very well with software. The folks who also put this together were also very familiar with some of the other processes at the time. So things like extreme programming, Scrum was another really big one. Crystal was one I've only ever heard about in the literature. I've never actually heard about it used. So I think that's fallen out of favor a little bit. But this document captured the essence that each of these approaches was really trying to get at. It boiled it down. So one of the things out of this entire presentation, if you remember nothing else, remember that Agile is a mindset. It's not a set of practices. So along with the food paradigm, if you are on a diet, your diet is kind of your directive. And the recipes and what you eat are how you're implementing that. So you can think of Agile as your diet, and your practices you're doing are how you're implementing this mindset. So this means that you, as a team of 1 or 1.5, or a very loose group of folks, can still be or do Agile without having all the structure around it that you might hear with some of the more popular frameworks. So having an Agile mindset, caveat, does not automatically improve your projects, but it does naturally work with a lot of the ways in which we work and what we're doing. So I won't go through the 12 principles, but they will show up a little bit later, and you can always go online to go find them. So in my work, as I was adopting more of an Agile mindset, a couple things and a couple points started emerging of these are processes that I need to figure out how to do better. One is you need a way to accumulate new tasks. Enough said. This is your work intake process. You need to figure out, okay, what are you going to work on next? Again, kind of self-explanatory. You need a way to evaluate this task is more important to work on this task next. You need a way to estimate. You need to break down the task and go, well, I think this is going to take me a week, but this one's going to take me like 3 years, so I might just chuck that one out. Or I might wait on it. Now, estimating is important. You might think, well, it's just me. I'll just take however long it takes to work on it. But again, we don't usually work in a vacuum. There's other people that may be depending on us. So you want to avoid this. You want to avoid having an estimate and then being like, oh, that's when you're going to get done by, right? No, it doesn't quite. That's not what I meant. So to prevent this, you need a way to communicate out your status. So at any given point, you want someone to be able to come to you and go, what's the status on this? And you can say, it's this. Without having too much overhead of like, you know what? I'll write you an email, and you spend the next 20 minutes writing an email about what you did the last month. But it's really hard because you kind of forgot. So communicating the status out is very actually important, even when you're working by yourself. It also keeps you honest about where you are and what you're working on. And at the end of it, you need a way to reevaluate your process, because we're not trying to cowboy program this. That is another wonderful term that if you look up any of your agile development for a team of one of the things you may come across is cowboy development, which is basically you're just shooting from the hip, and you're like, well, I'm going to work on this. There's a fire over there. I'm going to work on that now. But we want to put some process around it. So one of the parts of improving a process is the reevaluation at periodic times. All right, so we're going to go through these. We're going to take the frameworks that are out there already, take the pieces of it that work and that can be applied to a smaller scale. So we'll start with accumulating new tasks. A great place to start is with Kanban. Kanban, I believe, is just the Japanese word for card. This is adapted from software. Sorry, it's adapted from manufacturing for software. So the roots of this come out from the Toyota movement and how they got their factories to move a lot more efficiently. All you need to do this is you can take like a whiteboard. You could take some sticky notes on a whiteboard. What you'll see, the screenshots that I'm using are from a website called Trello, which is free, it's open to use, and basically it helps you make your boards and your little items on it. I believe Azure DevOps, as it's been recently renamed, /TFS also has a way to do Kanban boards. So how it works is pretty simple. You're maintaining a backlog of tasks. So in my left, I have my to-dos for making a Juicy Lucy. Who's ever had a Juicy Lucy? All right, if you haven't, they are pretty amazing. I highly recommend going and grabbing one if you enjoy burgers. So I have a backlog of tasks, so my to-do, doing, and done, and all my tasks are ordered by status. Two main rules that you want to keep in mind. One is that items move from the left to the right, never backwards. Sometimes they can move a little sideways. You might find that in this case, hey, I really want to have a status just as waiting, where it's passively going, but I'm not attending to it right now. So you can have as many statuses as is applicable to your situation. Rule number 2 is you need to have work in progress limits. So in this case, I have a work in progress limit of 1 in my doing category. Now what this does is it keeps you focused on what did I prioritize, what status is it in, and where am I at on it. So this kind of gets back to the being able to point to a Kanban board and saying, this is the status of everything right here, and anybody who wants to look at it can easily figure out where things are. So Kanban, one of the things it prides itself on is it's a pull system. So things can't move forward until the things in front of it have been completed. Kind of like when you're doing laundry, you can't really put more stuff in the dryer before you pull the stuff out of the dryer. So this is a pull system. Now you can get, this is very basic, you can get more complicated. This is maybe for an app, and I've added some extra metadata. So the tasks that are marked with a little red mark are like the difficult ones, and the ones with green are the easy ones. I still have my to-do, doing, and done. I'm still moving from left to right. But I've added like a date on there. I've added some other metadata. Now if it's just you, you might also find that, again, I need another status. So say I have a needs help status. So maybe I was working on something, and but it's really hard. I found out I don't have the resources for it, but I'm not going to move it backwards. You can create a new task that breaks it down maybe and get rid of that, and you can make maybe like another status being like, you know what, I was working on that, but I'm not going to do it. I'm trashing it, and I've recreated it as new tasks in my to-do, and you can move it through again. You still have the work in progress limits. You still have your left to right, but you can start adding complexity to this as you see fit. So Kanban boards work really well for, say, ticketing or issue systems. It works well for enhancements where you have things that you want to incrementally add. It does well for anything that's really an incremental approach to what you're doing. But if you need more structure, or if you want to have a little bit more complexity, or working with more ambiguity, Scrum is a very, very formalized process, and there's a couple things we can pull from this. So Scrum, as it exists with teams, was developed primarily for teams of developers of like 3 to 9 developers, all pulling from a single backlog of to-do tasks. There's a lot of tasks, ceremonies that are formalized with Scrum. A lot of them are more heavyweight than you'd really want to apply to one person. So if we think of Scrum as like an entire loaf of bread, we're just going to pick off some of the crumbs. So we get Scrum crumbs. It's cute. 3 things you can really pull off of it that are good. One is keeping a backlog of tasks. This is still something that you need to prioritize because unlike the full-blown Scrum, you don't have someone else who's prioritizing it for you. Having a backlog is also a really good place to include your stakeholders for feedback and to really include them in the process of what you're working on. Obviously, if you're your own stakeholder, you're still doing it yourself. Daily check-ins are also a very nice thing you can keep. You can do that whenever, say, you're starting work or maybe you're completing work at the end of the day. You go over what did I finish, what was accomplished, not what did I almost finish, what did I actually finish? What's your commitment for what's going to happen next? What are you committing to work in your next working session? But also being really real with yourself about what's keeping you from moving faster. Usually be typically called roadblocks. I have an issue with the term roadblock because to me that means there's something in my way and I can't move forward. When more often there's things in my way that are slowing me down. The last thing is that sprints are also conceptually a nice way to work. So this is a commitment that you make for, say, a 2 to 4 week time span of these are the set of tasks that I'm going to commit to getting done in this time span. So Scrum is, again, has a lot of ceremony around it, has a lot of very good formalized processes. And this can be approached if you're working with a solution set where you have a lot more ambiguity in what you're doing. All right, so that's work intake processes. Let's work on some prioritization. You have your tasks. What are you going to work on next? How do you decide? So an easy way is you have a to-do list. Let's put a priority on this. Easiest way to get started. So in this example, we see that the highest priority thing is let's lock the application to authorized users. Security, important, right? Okay. But maybe an easier task like I'm going to change the color of that button to be more intuitive is farther down your list, even though it doesn't take as long. So say you want to add a little bit more complexity, a little bit more nuance to this. You can add some weights to this. So in this case, I've added how long do I think this task is going to take, and what's the benefit, what's the payoff. So one of the things we see is that, okay, now we've kind of swapped what am I actually working on next. So locking the application to users falls down the priority list because it takes so long and there's not that much benefit. But you know, it's going to take me like 5 minutes to get that button changed, and it'll be way more intuitive, so I'm going to do that one first. So you can do things like adding quadrants or various evaluations, and you can make this as complicated or as simple as you need. It's very intuitive, but again, this is also another way that you can also communicate out what you're working on, why you're working on what you're working on. So someone comes along and says, hey, why are you working on changing the button color? I don't really need that. You should be working on the security thing. Well, that is now a conversation you can have with someone else saying, hey, this is how I evaluated it. If you think it should be evaluated differently, let's talk about that. but it gives them something to work with and it gives you a place to start from. All right, so prioritization, we'll leave that be because that is also very domain dependent upon what you're doing. All right, estimation. Now, I'm going to explain what the Pomodoro Technique is, and then I'll explain how it relates back to estimation. Who's ever heard of this, the Pomodoro Technique, before? All right, so a lot of you are already familiar with it. Very briefly, it's a tomato timer, like a kitchen timer. You set it for 25 minutes or so, and you focus on whatever task you're doing for that time, and you take a small break. You do that in like 3 or 4 chunks, and after 3 or 4 Pomodoro sessions, you take a longer break. So a couple nice things about this is it keeps you focused for a short period of time, and it also gives you high-quality breaks at the end. A couple ways to deal with interruptions, because interruptions are inevitably going to happen. Internal interruptions can happen when, like, I always have this thing where I have weird thoughts that come to my head, and I'm like, I really want to look that up. Or, hey, I could totally refactor this other part of the code, and it'll look way nicer. Write those down. Don't deal with them now if they're not part of what you committed to doing in those 25 minutes. External distractions also happen. So these are things like your phone calls, if anybody gets those anymore, IMs, emails, someone coming by your desk and talking with you. Usually you can defer someone for, say, like 20 minutes and be like, hey, I'm working on something, can I get back to you? A lot of people are like, yeah, sure, 20 minutes, I can do that. It sounds a lot better than, like, hey, I'm busy, I can't talk to you at all right now. They're probably not going to like that as much. So it helps with deferring some of what comes up. Now, funny enough, I was practicing this presentation last night, and my 2-year-old niece, at the time when I'm going over this slide, is handing me plastic food items, and so as I'm done with this slide, I have an entire, like, external distractions in my arms. So the Pomodoro Technique has worked very well for me. You can refocus after you're distracted. There's a feeling of urgency in 25 minutes, but not panic. You get tons of high-quality focused work. But this also leads to being able to estimate how long it actually takes me to do something. Because instead of ending the day and being like, you know what, I worked for like 2-ish hours in the morning on that one thing, and then like my afternoon was broken up with all sorts of like meetings and stuff, I can say, well, I had 3 Pomodoro sessions before I get interrupted. In the afternoon, I got 6. So now that makes it really easy to be like, okay, I got this many half-hour slots done. So this is an example of a breakdown of hours that I had for one of my sprints. So this is a breakdown of 35 out of the 51 hours I had. Now this made it easy to see where I was actually spending my time instead of just guessing at the end. This is going to be much more important if you're in a situation where you're billing hours. You're probably already on top of this kind of thing. But if you're not in a situation where you're not billing hours to a specific project or a specific task, this can be very eye-opening. One of the downsides is it does take a lot of discipline. So in this example, I was only counting on 1 hour for a pull request up in the green, but it really ended up taking me 4 hours. At the end of the sprint, that can be a question of why did it take so long? What was going on there? But that's one of those things at the end of a sprint I would probably just discount as like, yeah, it took extra long. But this is making it very in front of me of I spent more time on the pull requests, so there's other things I didn't get to, and this is why. It also forces me to break down tasks into small enough chunks where I can see after half an hour, like one Pomodoro session, did I get closer to actually finishing it, or did I just move a lot of code around? So if I think something's going to take me 2 hours, I should be like, well, after 2 Pomodoro sessions, I should be about halfway done, right? Well, if I'm not halfway done, I'm going to see real quick that, no, I still have more than an hour left on this. So a couple of things we can pull from Scrum in this case. One concept is this thing called planning poker. So the idea with planning poker is that in a team setting is that people have these cards, and then when it comes time to estimate certain tasks, people put down a card of how long they think it'll take, And if there's discrepancies, you all talk about what the task is and how to scope it. Sounds rather time-consuming. And again, it's overkill if it's just you. But one thing you can kind of do is you can kind of play a high-low game. So if you have a task you're like, I really don't know how long this is going to take, you think about, okay, what's the happy path? If nothing goes wrong, how long is this going to take me at a minimum? Then think about if all the things that pretty much could get wrong and I still finish it go wrong, how long is this going to take me? So now you have a high, you have a low. If you still want to work on it, you've already identified a lot of the unknowns and risks about it. Then you take a moderate amount. What are some of the risks that are going to be realized realistically? And you pick something in the middle. It won't make your estimates perfect, but over time, it can help you gain more accurate estimates. It also forces you to really think about what are the risks and what are the things that I'm not thinking about and glossing over just mentally. It's an oversimplification, but in some cases, especially with larger tasks, this can be especially helpful to play this little mental high-low game in your mind. All right, working with your key stakeholders. Now, your stakeholders might be you. They might be totally absent. They might be on the other side of the world. They might be disengaged, or they might be in your face all the time. It's all over the board. But the Agile Manifesto calls out a couple of the principles about working with either your stakeholders or, say, an analyst or someone who's involved in the process, even though they might not be the answerable person. So 2 things that are important here is one is involving them in the process, obviously where appropriate. As the first point points out, it's talking about business people. It does not necessarily mean your stakeholder has to be involved on a daily basis. But involving the people around you who might be relevant to the project, especially since a lot of times other people are relying on you to give direction, especially in a lot of these unguided situations. Another thing you want to do is make it easy for your stakeholders to give you information and make it easy for them to understand information that you're giving them. This is something I think a lot of tech-minded folks fall into or not have a hard time grasping. If I send out a message to my project manager talking about the pull request and that there's a git merge conflict in there, they don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. I'm not making it easy for them to understand how to evaluate. So how much longer is this going to take? Which is what they really want to know. So make it easy for them to understand information from you. Now, this was an example of an email that I got from a project manager once where he was not making it easy for me to understand what he was talking about. And this was the entire email, it was just the one line. So one of the things I had found out when I've been working on projects, especially smaller one with disengaged business users, is that when things start out, I can send an update once in a while, and either I'll hear nothing at all or, yep, sounds good, keep going. But as soon as a timeline slipped or deployment slipped or something wasn't quite right, they'd get really nervous. Because contrary to the no news is good news, no news meant something was going terribly wrong, they didn't know what it was, and they were scared. So if there's no one else around to facilitate that regular communication, it is up to you, as uncomfortable as that might be. Face-to-face or in-person communication is going to be the most efficient because it's an efficient way to communicate those uncomfortable conversations, a lot of concerns, and also to convey satisfaction with good work that you have been doing. I also want to point out that something I've seen a lot of tech-minded folks fall into is when you're demoing something. Say at the end of a sprint, you completed something after your 2 weeks, you want to show someone what you worked on, and so you show them maybe over a Skype call or you're in person, and you're showing them all the buttons that you added and the things you did. I'd like to challenge you the next time is to have your business user, whoever's consuming it, drive where possible. Because they're going to pick up more, they're going to voice their concerns without you asking. And if you say, okay, click on that button over there, they'll be like, wait, what button? And it'll become very obvious to you, oh, it's not they're not seeing what I think is very obvious to me. But that stuff doesn't come out if you're just showing them and they're just watching you. So another bone to pick on, and I'll go over this very briefly, is emails. Writing good emails is not specific to development. It's not specific to any business area. But it is a very important skill, especially if you're the only person who's facilitating the communication with whoever you're working with. So, a couple pointers on, in my opinion, on writing good emails. One is putting your action items on top. So, a lot of people are busy, and if you know anybody who at the end of the day, they're like, I have 50 emails. Again, make it easy for them to know exactly what you want from them. What action do you want them to take? If there's nothing that they need to do, that's a good first line to start off with, saying, I don't actually need you to do anything. This is a reference email. So use bold, use underline, use your rich text formatting where possible. Make sure that they know if they only read one thing from your email, what do you want them to know? Next thing is to organize the text in a logical manner, so it's easy to find. So if you're able to look at these, it's easy to figure out what each paragraph is talking about. You don't have to read through the whole thing. You should be able to just read like the first line or the first sentence or the bolded words to get, okay, I know what that paragraph's about. And the last one is not as intuitive. It's to use third person. And I'm not talking about referring to yourself in third person. Using third person is advocated by a lot of collegiate and professional writing guides as well. And so what that does is it shifts the focus from, I worked on fixing this problem, to the problem was X and it's fixed by Y. Because a lot of times who you're writing for doesn't really want to know what you personally learned or what you personally worked on. They want to know at the end of the day, what's the results? What do I need to do? And is everything working? So tell them that. Writing in third person is also uncomfortable at first, but it ends up being much more concise. So your emails become more dense, and it's easier to read. It's easier to facilitate that communication. All right, let's talk about software quality. So one of the points from the Agile Manifesto, two of the principles actually, are talking about quality. Quality should enhance your agility. So it's not added on as an afterthought, like, you know what, I hacked something together, I'm going to go back and fix it. First of all, how many times do you actually do that? Second of all, it's kind of annoying to have to go back and fix something. It's typically easier to build it in, oh no. Let's try this again. I bumped my computer cord. There we go. So one of the questions that comes up is, can you ever have too much quality? Can you ever make it too good? Well, one of the answers to that is there's a book that I really, really love, and I've kind of linked at the bottom here. It's Lean Software Development, an Agile toolkit by some local folks, Tom and Mary Popendick. So in it, they mention that quality in design means realization of purpose or fitness for use. So it's not about, did I conform to all the requirements that were laid out? It's, did what I add make this application easier to use, more intuitive? Did it make it better in that sense? So using this idea of quality, no, you can never have too much quality. Because if you're adding something that's not going to be used or doesn't make your software work any better from the end user perspective, then you might be gold plating it. You might be adding things that aren't actually adding any value. So one of the things that can help guard against this is time boxing appropriately. So if you say, I think this is going to save my end users 20 hours. I don't know. But it doesn't make sense maybe for you to work on it for 100 if it's going to save people 20. Depends on how many users you have, but So appropriate estimating and time boxing what you're working on can also help avoid the gold plating concept. So what can you as a small team do to improve your quality? Well, we're going to rely on some automated tools, and here's a couple things to think about. So in the kitchen, when you don't have someone to wash your dishes, you get to wash them. But a lot of us have dishwashers. This is an automated tool that'll get a lot of the work done for us. It doesn't relieve us from doing any work, of doing any dishwashing. You still have to stack the dishwasher, you still have to run it, you have to unload it. And there's still some things that you have to do manually, so yes, you still have to wash some of your pots and pans or your knives. But dishwashers are really great. They do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So similarly for software development, use and leverage the built-in automated tools that are available to you. So automated tests that you write, so things like integration tests, unit tests, can be really useful for regression testing, for any features or fixes that you put in there. It can also be used for some of the security tests. So I don't do a lot of the security stuff, but I know there's stuff that's automated out there that you can use. Writing tests does take work, but just like loading and unloading the dishwasher, you can keep doing it. It's an automated process that'll speed stuff up later. So another thing that's very popular is code reviews. We kind of have an issue. How do you do code reviews by yourself? I mean, just like pair programming, like how do you do pair programming by yourself? Although we did have one developer for a while who said pair programming is best done by yourself. I always found that amusing. You really need an outside perspective, though. So the static code reviews can help with some of the security vulnerabilities. It's also possible to pull in other developers for shorter, more intensive review sessions. Remember, working by yourself on a project doesn't mean that you're totally alone. I mean, look around the room. There's lots of other developers here, too. So there's a good chance that wherever you are in whatever situation you're in, there's other people that you can pull in to bounce ideas off. They don't necessarily need to have the domain knowledge that you do, and in fact, that's almost better. Or you can still talk to the duck. A lot of the benefit of code reviews, though, isn't so much for catching defects as they are for catching architectural flaws or issues or improvements. So some of the code reviews you want to catch aren't necessarily, did I do this right? Did I have any misspellings? But a lot of it, you're also seeking guidance for bigger questions like, how am I approaching this? What would be a better way to approach this? And that's something you can also do with our online communities. So Stack Exchange, in addition to our Stack Overflow, there's a QA test, or a QA site in beta right now, last I checked. And there's also the software engineering site. Now the software engineering site has a lot of people putting code up there saying, I'm approaching it this way, what are ways that it could be improved? Am I taking the right approach? This part looks really ugly. Has anybody seen a better way to do it? Put your stuff up there, see what you get. Answer other people's questions, because again, code reviews help both the person who's submitted the code, but also those who are reviewing it to see, hey, that's a different way, I didn't think about doing that. So I encourage everybody to, at the very least, take a look at these sites, even if you don't post on it. It's good growth for both anybody who's experienced in these areas, as well as people who are new in these areas. So tap your online communities. All right, this kind of brings us to the last point of your retrospective. So the idea of a retrospective is to prove the process that you have been doing. This is really important because when you first start off, you're going to find some things that don't work very well. And you're going to find some things that you're like, hey, this is really hard, but this is really rewarding. So the example I have on this one is I had Juicy Lucy's for 4 days in a row because someone at my house was trying to figure out how to make it just right. It was delicious, but by the end, I'm like, I don't think I can handle any more burgers. By reviewing it each day, though, we found what are the things to change and what are the things to keep. So the manifesto actually calls out the retrospectives very specifically. So at regular intervals, you want to reflect and adjust. One easy way to do this is with a start, stop, continue. So what should you start doing that you haven't been doing? What should you stop doing that's really not helping? So for example, I use Spotify playlists. I've made playlists that are 25 minutes long with a 5-minute interlude of rock music. So I have half-hour playlists, and I have them in sets of 4. Like, that's something that's worked really well for me. But maybe at the end of the sprint, I say, you know what? Those playlists I have where it has music with words in it, I'm getting really distracted with those. I should stop using those playlists. And I should maybe make a new one instead. And of course, the continue. What's working, then you want to keep doing. So I can say, well, the classical music one is working out really well. But the foreign language learning playlist is not working for me, so I'll drop that one. Now, if you want to get in another level deeper into the retrospective, I would highly recommend reading the Lean Software Development book, once again. It's not a huge book, but one of the concepts that's pulled again from the manufacturing side is the 7 types of waste. So in manufacturing, this could be things like overproduction. It can be things like moving product from A to B and then B to C instead of just A to C. It can be times that lines are down because of system malfunctions. Tom and Mary have done a good job of translating these to software because a lot of times they don't translate specifically one for one. And I don't actually know if they came up with this translation. I suspect that they did because I know Mary has a background in manufacturing. So it's a couple of the things you can look into is unfinished work. Did you have anything that you're like, I'm going to work on this. It says at a pull request right now. I need someone to review it. But that was 2 months ago. So right now, that is wasted work. So either you need someone to help finish that up, or you need to drop it and say, okay, you know what, from now on, I'm going to be a lot more careful about, or just do my changes in smaller chunks, so it's going to flow through better. Extra features. If you added a feature, they're like, hey, this is great, I think they'll really love it, and nobody uses it, that is also wasted work, even though it might be really cool. Relearning. How many of you have ever learned something, never used it, and a year later, like, I learned it, but now I have to go back? A couple people. I know I've run into that, and so now when I have an opportunity to learn something new, I'm a lot more careful about, is this something I can either immediately apply, or am I going to apply in the near future? Because if I'm not, it might be a great opportunity, but it's not worth my time to learn it now and have to relearn it later. This also comes into play when, if you're making changes and you have a series of changes to make, to group them together. Because having to go back to some of your snippets of your code and be like, I don't really remember what I was doing here, but it would have been really nice had I grouped these items together and worked on them. Handoffs are another bee in my bonnet that I feel strongly about. If you're going to hand off your application to someone else, either make sure they're going to be working with it right away, or you know what, just save yourself both the hour and just write up some documentation. Delays, another big one. So if you're working on something and you need help working on it, but you can't get the help to work on it for like another week, well, that's going to be that's something maybe in your Kanban board that's going to be sitting in the I need help category, taking up space. Or you could have something else in there that could move faster. Task switching is another big one. One of the things to help with this is if you have lots of monitor space, you're not flipping between windows all the time. So it can happen at small granular levels like that. But it can also happen at larger levels where if you have 3 half-hour meetings and they're all spaced half an hour, that's a lot of task switching you have to do. So maybe you can, as a retrospective, find ways to group your meetings together. And defects, obviously, bugs, issues that come up, form of waste. So we're at the end. There's some resources up here. I don't have a large social media presence, but I'm on LinkedIn, and I would encourage anybody to come and show up to the .NET user group that meets every Thursday on the first Thursday of the month. You can find me there most of the time, and I'm around the Twin Cities as well. I'll be here for the next day of the conference as well. Feel free to come up to me, ask me questions, talk to me about what you were working on, and I'm also very open to feedback. So to wrap up, and then we'll have time for questions. Jim Higgs-Smith was one of the signers of this original Agile Manifesto way back when. And so he wrote a blog post that was reflecting on like the last 15 years of this Agile movement. And he said the roots of agility are in complex adaptive systems. The notion of operating at the edge of chaos. The knife-edge balancing point between chaos and stifling structure. We can't forget that agility isn't about structure, practices, and conventions. Agility is ultimately about living on the edge and of pushing the envelope. So thank you very much, and we'll take some questions.